My name is Ethan, and I live in a small, isolated town on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. It's peaceful out here. No traffic, no noise. Just miles of forest surrounding my little house, with the nearest neighbor being a good 10-minute drive away. It's the kind of place you go to get away from everything, where you can feel truly alone. I've always liked that, or at least I thought I did. It all started last summer, one of those scorching August afternoons when the air feels heavy and thick. I was sitting on my porch sipping iced tea when I saw him. He came walking up my driveway, looking tired and dusty, his clothes worn from what seemed like a long journey. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a hiker who got lost, or someone whose car broke down. People get turned around out here all the time. As he approached, he gave me a wave, a small, polite gesture that immediately made me lower my guard. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he called out, his voice steady and calm. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down a few miles back. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call a tow." He seemed normal enough. Early 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. Nothing about him screamed danger. And out here, where strangers are rare, you kind of feel obligated to help when someone shows up at your doorstep. So I invited him in. I know, it was stupid. But hindsight's always 20/20ths, right? Inside, he thanked me again, dialing the number for the tow service while I grabbed him a glass of water. "Name's Charlie, by the way," he said, flashing me a friendly smile. I introduced myself, and we exchanged small talk while he waited on hold. The whole situation felt oddly comfortable, despite the fact that there was a stranger in my house. But after a while, something started to feel off. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it changed, but it was like a shift in the air. He'd been on the phone for a long time, too long, and I noticed he wasn't really talking anymore, just holding the phone to his ear, glancing around my living room like he was casing the place. My gut tightened. "Any luck with the tow?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he just hung up the phone, turned to me and smiled. But this time there was something unsettling about that smile. Something wrong. "Tow truck won't be here for hours," he said, still smiling. "Mind if I wait here for a while?" I didn't like the way he was looking at me. His eyes had a kind of intensity, like he was sizing me up. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but I didn't want to escalate things, so I nodded, telling myself I was overreacting. "Sure, no problem." We sat there in awkward silence, and that's when I noticed he wasn't tired anymore. His earlier exhaustion had evaporated, replaced by an eerie calm. His gaze lingered on the door, then flickered back to me. My pulse quickened. Something was definitely wrong. That's when it hit me. I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter, out of reach, and Charlie was between me and the only exit. I needed to get control of the situation, fast. "So, where exactly did your car break down?" I asked, hoping to buy some time while I thought of a plan. Charlie leaned back in the chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Just a few miles down the road. Funny thing though, I didn't see a single other car. No one around. It's real quiet out here, huh?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Real isolated." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced. I had a flashlight in the garage and an old hunting knife in the shed, but they were both outside. Getting to either one would mean moving past him. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. "It's quiet." Then he stood up, stretching his arms slowly. "You live here alone?" The question was casual, but the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, nodding. "Just me and the trees." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "That's nice. No one to bother you. No one to hear if something goes wrong." That was it. The moment I knew I had to act. This guy wasn't stranded. He was here for something else, something far worse. I stood up quickly, trying to keep my movements calm, and made my way toward the kitchen. I needed to get to the phone, but before I could even take 2 steps, he lunged at me, slamming me against the wall. The force knocked the wind out of me, and for a split second, I was sure it was over. "You don't need to do this," I gasped, struggling against his grip. His face twisted into a cruel grin. "Oh, but I do. See, I need your car. I need your stuff, and I don't need you around to get it." Panic surged through me, but then I remembered something. A way out. During my renovations last year, I'd built a small crawl space behind the bookshelf, mostly for storage. It wasn't obvious, and it was my only chance. With all the strength I could muster, I shoved him hard, catching him off guard just enough to break free. I bolted for the living room, yanking the bookshelf aside and squeezing into the crawl space. I pulled the door shut behind me just as I heard him storming after me. Heart pounding, I held my breath, listening to him search the house. He tore through my belongings, smashing furniture and shouting obscenities. I stayed silent, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard the sound of him leaving. The door slammed, followed by the engine of my car roaring to life. He was gone. It took me another hour to work up the courage to come out of the crawl space. When I did, the house was a wreck, but I was alive. I called the police and they found my car abandoned a few miles down the road, but Charlie was long gone. They told me he was an escaped convict, wanted for multiple violent crimes. I still think about that night, about how normal he seemed at first, how easy it was to let my guard down. And I realized something terrifying. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it looks like just another person asking for help. That's what haunts me the most. It was a quiet evening, the kind that lulled you into a sense of security. My family lived in a small house on the edge of town, tucked away from the busier streets. It wasn't exactly rural, but it wasn't close to anyone else either. Just a couple of houses scattered along a lonely road that led into a patch of woods. I was 15 at the time, a regular teenager, and the most excitement we usually got was a stray dog wandering too close to the yard or the occasional power outage. But that night was different. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A faint banging, like someone knocking on the front door. It was strange because no one ever came to our house this late, especially not out here. I thought it might have been my imagination at first, but then it came again, louder. I got up and made my way down the hall. My parents were already in the living room, staring at the door with confused expressions. My dad, being the cautious guy he was, motioned for me to stay back while he approached the door. Through the peephole, he looked out into the night. "Who is it?" my mom asked, her voice uneasy. "I don't know," my dad muttered. "It's some guy. Looks like he's in bad shape." Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped closer. My dad opened the door just a crack, and there he was. A man, mid-30s maybe, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt and blood. He was breathing heavily, eyes wide with fear. "Please," he rasped, "you have to help me. They're coming." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. My dad didn't open the door any further. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice steady but guarded. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows at any moment. "They're after me. They'll be here any minute. I don't have much time. Please, let me in." My mom stepped forward now, concern etched across her face. "You're hurt," she said, but my dad raised a hand to stop her. "Hold on," my dad said, his tone firm. "What's going on? Who's after you?" The man's hands were shaking, and he clutched his side like he was in serious pain. I don't know who they are. They've been following me since I got into town. I think they're trying to kill me." At this point, my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to believe. This guy looked desperate, terrified even, but something about the situation felt off. Like there was more to the story that he wasn't telling us. "We need to call the police," my dad said, glancing at my mom. "Now." But before anyone could move, the man spoke again, his voice trembling. "There's no time. They're already here. You have to let me in." My dad hesitated, and in that brief moment, he turned to look out the side window. That's when he saw them. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 50 feet away, in the trees at the edge of our property, I could make out the faint shapes of figures moving through the darkness, slow, deliberate, like they were hunting something, or someone. "Get away from the windows," my dad ordered, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "Now!" We all stepped back, and my dad, for the first time, opened the door just enough to pull the man inside. He stumbled in, collapsing onto the floor with a grunt of pain. My mom grabbed a towel and pressed it to his wound, while my dad grabbed the phone to call the police. "Please hurry," my mom whispered into the phone. There are men outside. They're trying to break in." As we waited for the police, the tension in the room grew unbearable. The man on the floor was gasping, his hands stained with his own blood, and outside, the figures were moving closer. We could hear them now, footsteps crunching on the gravel, low murmurs that sounded like they were discussing their next move. My dad, a former Marine, wasn't the kind of guy to sit back and do nothing. He had a small handgun, an old .38 revolver that he kept locked away for emergencies. This qualified as one. He retrieved it from the safe in his bedroom and stationed himself near the front window, keeping an eye on the men outside. "How many of them?" I asked, my voice shaky. "At least 3, my dad replied, eyes narrowed. "Maybe more." Then it happened. A loud bang echoed through the house, a sound like someone kicking at the back door. My mom gasped, clutching the man on the floor a little tighter. "They're trying to get in," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. My dad moved quickly, stepping to the back of the house and shouting through the door, "Get off my property! The police are on their way!" For a moment, there was silence. Then the men outside started yelling, cursing, demanding that we hand over the man. "He's a dead man," one of them shouted. "You can't hide him." My dad didn't flinch. He fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack echoing into the night. That bought us a few seconds of quiet, but it didn't last long. The men regrouped, and we heard footsteps circling the house. They were planning something. It was at that moment that we saw the flash of blue and red lights approaching in the distance. The police. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. One of the men outside yelled something unintelligible, and before we knew it, there was a sudden rush toward the house, like they were making one final push to break in. My dad fired another shot, this time aiming at the ground near the front steps. The men scattered, but not far. Then, like a miracle, the police arrived, 2 squad cars screeching to a stop at the edge of our driveway. The men who had been stalking our house fled into the woods, but the officers were quick. They chased down 2 of them, handcuffed them right there in our yard. As the police secured the scene, we finally let out a collective breath. The man we had led into our home was taken to the hospital, his injuries more serious than we'd realized. The officers told us that he had a criminal record, a history of theft and some violent behavior. But it wasn't clear why those men had been after him. They suspected it was something to do with a robbery gone wrong, maybe a gang dispute. We never found out the full story. What I learned that night, though, was this. Not every act of kindness goes unpunished, and sometimes danger comes to your door wrapped in desperation. You never know who you can trust, even when someone is begging for help. And even in a quiet town like ours, the worst kind of evil can be lurking just beyond the tree line. I've lived in Ashbrook my whole life, a small town where nothing ever happens. You know the kind, where everyone waves at each other on the street, and you can't go to the grocery store without running into someone who knows your family. It's the sort of place where people trust their neighbors without a second thought. But that trust is fragile, and I was about to learn just how quickly it could shatter. It all started when Mr. Walters moved in next door. He was in his early 50s, a bit overweight, always dressed in plain clothes. He introduced himself to us on his first day, carrying over a basket of baked goods like something out of an old sitcom. My parents thought he was great, a real good neighbor, they said. But something about him never sat right with me. At first I brushed it off as paranoia. I mean, I'm just a teenager, right? What do I know about people? But then I started noticing things. Mr. Walters would leave his house late at night, well after midnight, and come back just before dawn. Sometimes he was carrying black trash bags that were oddly heavy, and I could swear I saw him digging around in his backyard with a shovel more than once. The first few times I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe he was just doing something weird like composting or working late. But the more I watched, the more it ate at me. One night, I woke up to the sound of his truck revving up. It was 3 a.m., and I couldn't resist sneaking a look from my bedroom window. I saw him throwing something large into the bed of his truck, wrapped tightly in a tarp. It looked heavy. He glanced around nervously, like he was afraid someone was watching. That's when I realized. He knew I had been watching. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. I told my best friend Jake about it during lunch. He laughed it off, saying I was probably just imagining things. Come on, man. The guy's probably just a weirdo. It doesn't mean he's up to something illegal, Jake had said, shaking his head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. That night, I kept my lights off and stared out the window, waiting to see if Mr. Walters would make another late-night trip. And he did. Around 2:30 a.m. I saw him again, only this time he wasn't loading his truck. He was standing outside, looking directly at my house, or more specifically, my window. My heart pounded in my chest. I stepped back quickly, hoping he hadn't seen me, but it was too late. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. My mom answered it, and there was Mr. Walters, smiling as usual, holding a small box of cookies. I lingered in the hallway, listening. He chatted with my mom like everything was fine, but as he handed her the box, he asked, "How's your boy doing? Haven't seen him around much." My blood ran cold. He knew, somehow, he knew I'd been watching him. That evening, I decided I had to know what was going on. I waited until my parents were asleep, then slipped out of the house and over to Mr. Walters' yard. There was a faint smell in the air, something rancid. His truck was parked in the driveway, but I noticed something else. Fresh dirt near the back fence. It was dark, but I could see where the grass had been dug up recently. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. A partially exposed tarp sticking out of the ground. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I had to call the police. But before I could dial, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, and there was Mr. Walters, standing in the shadows, smiling that same unnerving smile. "You shouldn't be out here, kid. You never know what kind of people lurk around at night," he said softly, his grip tightening on my arm. I broke free and ran as fast as I could back to my house. I locked the door behind me, my heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night, terrified that he might come for me. The next day, I told my parents everything. At first, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just being a paranoid kid. But I knew what I saw. I made the call to the police myself, and when they showed up, they found more than just freshly dug earth. Behind Mr. Walters' house, buried deep in the soil, were several tarps, each one holding something horrific, human remains. It turned out that Mr. Walters wasn't who he said he was. He had been living under a false identity for years, hiding from his past. He was wanted in several states for the murders of hitchhikers and drifters, people who wouldn't be missed. He'd move from town to town, blending in, earning trust, and then he'd strike. The news of his arrest shocked the town. People couldn't believe it. This man who brought cookies to his neighbors and waved at passers-by had been hiding a dark secret. But I'll never forget the way he smiled at me that night, as if daring me to do something. True evil can wear a friendly face, and sometimes the monsters live next door.